Dexter Sawyer came back from the war with three things: a scar along his left jawline, a horse named Corporal, and a woman's face burned so deeply into his memory that he could trace every line of it with his eyes closed, even though she had never existed at all. That was the truth of it, and it was a strange kind of truth to carry. During the long, bleeding years of the Civil War, from the muddy horror of Shiloh in 1862 to the grinding, soul-destroying siege work in Virginia, Dexter had survived by building a home inside his own mind. Other men thought of their mothers, their sweethearts, the smell of their fathers' farms. Dexter had no farm left to think of. His mother had died of fever when he was 9. His father had drunk himself into an early grave the year before the war started. There was no sweetheart waiting, no sister writing letters, no soft voice that belonged to him. So he invented one. He built her slowly, the way a man builds a house with whatever lumber is at hand. He gave her brown hair first, the color of creek water in autumn when the light hits it just right. He gave her hands that were capable and unhurried. He gave her a laugh that she kept mostly to herself, the kind that started low and grew, like she was always a little surprised that something had turned out to be funny. He gave her eyes that were patient in a way that had nothing to do with resignation, patient the way still water is patient, the way deep ground is patient. She was not a delicate woman in his imagination. She was not a porcelain thing. She was solid and warm and real in that invented way, and when the artillery would open up and the world became nothing but noise and smoke and the screaming of men and horses, Dexter would close his eyes behind whatever wall or ditch he had pressed himself against and go home to her. He called her nothing for a long time. Names made things too solid. Names could be taken from you. He was 22 years old when he mustered out in the spring of 1865, thin as wire and quieter than he had been since before he could remember being loud. He collected his discharge papers, shook a few hands that meant something to him and a great many more that didn't, and he pointed Corporal west. He had no particular destination. That was the honest answer he gave himself when he lay awake under open skies. West was a direction, and direction was enough for a man who had nothing to go back to. He had heard there was land in the territories, land that did not belong to anyone who would be coming to ask for it back. He had heard there was work in the cattle towns. He had heard that in some parts of the country a man could simply start, without the weight of everything he had been. He rode through Missouri and into Kansas, through the flat shimmer of summer grass that went on so long it started to feel like a statement about eternity. He hired on with a cattle outfit south of Abilene in the summer of 1865, working the long drives north, sleeping on ground that smelled of sage and dust and the particular democracy of the open range, where a man was mostly just a man, and the cattle did not care about the war or who had won it. He was 24 by the time he arrived in the small town of Calla Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1867. Calla Creek was the kind of town that looked like it was still deciding whether to become a real town or simply drift away into the prairie it had been cut out of. There was a main street of packed earth that turned to thick mud in the rain and to choking dust in the dry season. There was a general store run by a man named Hob Greer who talked constantly and meant well. There was a saloon called the Crossed Spur that smelled of whiskey and sawdust and old arguments. There was a livery, a small church that held services every other Sunday when the preacher came through on his circuit, and a scattering of homesteads beyond the town proper, staked out along the line of a creek that ran dependably enough to make the land worth the trouble. There was also a woman named Eva Hurst, and Dexter Sawyer did not know about her yet. He came to Calla Creek because Corporal had thrown a shoe 3 miles outside of town, and because the evening was coming in fast and cold from the north, the kind of cold that October carried in its teeth in that part of Texas. He walked the horse in slowly, watching the lights come on in the windows of the few buildings that lined the street, and he felt the familiar mix of feelings that every small town produced in him by then, a kind of wary longing, a reaching toward warmth that his hands kept stopping short of. He stabled Corporal at the livery, paid the stable hand, and walked across to the cross spur because it was the warmest-looking building, and because he had eaten nothing since a handful of dried beef at noon. The saloon was half full with the kind of men that Dexter recognized from 2 years of trail work ranch hands, a couple of drifters, a man in the corner playing cards with the careful concentration of someone who was not entirely sober, but was trying hard to pretend otherwise. The barkeep was a heavy-set man named Lou Dawes, Dexter would learn, who poured fair measures and asked no unnecessary questions, which was about the highest praise Dexter could give a man in those days. He ordered food and whiskey and sat with his back to the wall, which was a habit the war had given him and the trail had reinforced, and he ate quietly and listened to the room the way he always listened to rooms, for tone, for tension, for whatever the temperature of a place was before he decided how long to stay. He stayed longer than he planned because the food was better than he expected and because Lou Dawes mentioned, when Dexter asked about work, that the Hurst place was looking for a hand. "Hurst place," Dexter said. "Eva Hurst. She's got 40 acres out along the east fork of the creek. Good land for what it is. She runs a small herd, some chickens, grows what she can." Lou Dawes wiped down the bar with the slow, meditative motion of a man who found comfort in repetitive tasks. "Her husband passed 18 months back. Fever took him. She's been managing on her own since." "She managing all right." Lou Dawes paused in his wiping. "She's managing. I didn't say all right." Dexter slept in the livery that night, the way he had slept in dozens of lofts and barns and open fields. And in the morning, he rode Corporal Reshad by the stable hand at first light out along the East Fork Road, following Lou Dawes' directions with the particular attention to landscape that 2 years of military campaign had made automatic in him. He found the Hurst property easily enough. The fence line was neat, but needed some attention in 2 places he could see from the road. The house was a solid construction, whitewashed wood that had gone a little gray with weather, with a porch along the front and a kitchen garden to one side that had been put to bed for winter with a care that said the person who tended it knew what they were doing. There was a barn behind, smaller than he would have expected for the acreage, and a pole corral with 4 horses in it, 3 of them looking trail-worn and one looking like it had been ridden hard recently. He stopped Corporal at the gate and called out, because a man on another person's property without invitation was a man asking for trouble in any part of the West he had ever been in. "Hello, the house." There was a pause, then the front door opened. Eva Hurst stepped onto the porch. Dexter Sawyer looked at her, and something inside him went very, very still. She was nothing like what he had invented, and she was everything like what he had invented. And those 2 things hit him at the same moment with the force of something he could not immediately name or account for. Her hair was brown creek water in autumn, he thought, and then stopped thinking because that was a strange thought to have about a woman you had never met. She was not tall, but she carried herself like someone who had made peace with exactly the height she was. She was looking at him with the particular directness of someone who had learned that hesitation cost more than it saved, and her eyes were a shade of gray-green that he had not invented and would not have known to invent. She was 30 years old, he would find out later. She had come to Texas from Tennessee with her husband, Thomas Hurst, 4 years earlier. She had buried Thomas and carried on because carrying on was what was left. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was steady, not cold, but carrying the kind of watchfulness that made sense in a widow alone on 40 acres. "My name is Dexter Sawyer," he said. "I heard at the cross spur last night that you might be needing a hired hand. I've got 2 years trail experience, some before that on a farm in Kentucky, and I'm a fair carpenter when the work asks for it. I'm not looking to impose. If you're not hiring, I'll be on my way." She studied him from the porch. It was not a short study. He sat still under it because he had learned that the right response to being assessed was to simply be what you were and let the assessment come out where it did. "You got references?" she asked. I can give you the name of Elias Cord, trail boss out of Abilene. He'll vouch for me. Where'd you serve? He had not mentioned the war. But then he supposed his age and a certain quality of stillness in men who had come back from it were probably enough to read. Army of the Tennessee. Infantry. She nodded once, as though he had answered a question she had been asking herself rather than him. I can offer room in the barn and 3 meals a day and $2 a week until the winter work is done. After that, I'll see what the spring looks like and whether I've got enough to keep someone on. That's fair, he said. You can put your horse in the corral. I'll show you where things are. That was how it began. The first weeks were mostly work and mostly silence, and Dexter found he did not mind either. The Hurst place had a rhythm to it, morning chores. The tending of the small herd of 12 longhorns that Eva kept for the drive income, the fence repair and the barn maintenance, and the 100 small tasks that a working property in that country required. He threw himself into the work with the focus of a man who knew how to use labor as a kind of anchor, how to tie himself to the present moment through the weight of physical effort. Eva was a competent manager of her land, and she did not pretend otherwise. She had her own opinions about how things should be done, and she expressed them clearly and without apology, and Dexter respected that in the way he respected any person who knew their own mind. There was no false deference in her, no performance of helplessness that some women of that era believed they owed to men. She had been running this land for 18 months alone, and if she needed a hired hand, it was because the work was more than one person could physically manage in a day, not because she did not understand the work. They developed a working relationship that was, in those early weeks, primarily practical and primarily silent. They would pass each other in the yard, exchange the necessary words about what needed doing, share meals at the kitchen table in the way of employer and employee politely, with a certain formality that was mostly just mutual caution. Then, on a cold November evening about 3 weeks after he arrived, Dexter was working late in the barn, finishing the repairs on a section of stall wall that had gone soft with rot, and Eva came out with a lantern and a cup of coffee. "You don't have to work past dark," she said, holding the cup out to him. "I want to finish this section before the temperature drops any further," he said. "Wood contracts when it gets cold and the new boards won't seat right." She looked at the work he had done. He could see her studying it with the same directness she had studied him that first morning, assessing without sentiment. "You do good work," she said. "I do," he agreed, which made her pause and then do that thing he had not yet seen her do, that slow-building surprise of a laugh that started low in her chest and worked its way up. "Not modest," she said. "I was honest," he said. "There's a difference." She sat down on a hay bale near the lantern and held her own cup of coffee, and for the first time since he had arrived, they were not in the mode of employer and employee or the polite formality of shared meals. They were just two people in a warm barn while the wind came in cold outside. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Kentucky, Hardin County, but I don't have anything to go back to there." "I know something about that," she said quietly. He looked at her. The lantern light moved softly in the space between them. "Your husband Thomas." Yes, she turned the cup in her hands. "He was a good man. He believed in this land and what it could be. He died believing it, which is something, I suppose." "I'm sorry." "I've had time to be sorry," she said, and the words were not hard, just worn to a smooth surface by handling. "Now I just try to make good on what he believed in." Dexter went back to his work and she sat a little longer, and the silence between them was different from the silence that had been there before. It had a texture now, a warmth. November deepened into December, and the work shifted with the season. The cattle drive would not come until spring, so the winter work was mostly maintenance, feed management, the slow indoor tasks of a working property in cold weather. Dexter repaired the porch steps, which had been threatening to give way since before he arrived. He rehung 2 doors that had warped in the summer heat and never properly recovered. He built a new section of fence along the north pasture with cedar posts that would hold for 10 years. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, he and Eva Hurst began to talk. It happened the way most real things happened, in his experience gradually, and then all at once. A comment over breakfast about the state of the fence posts led to a conversation about the land, which led to her telling him about the plans she and Thomas had made for expanding the herd, which led to Dexter asking questions about the land itself, the water table, the winter grass, the way the creek behaved in the wet season. She knew her land the way some people know another person, intimately, with the detailed knowledge of someone who has paid close attention over time. He found himself listening to her the way he had not listened to anyone in a very long time, not just for information, for the pleasure of it. She asked him about the trail, about Kansas, about the places he had been. He told her about the drives, the long days in the saddle, the smell of 10,000 head of cattle moving north, the strange democracy of the range where what a man could do mattered more than what he had been. He told her about the men he had worked with, some of their stories, the landscape of the plains as he had ridden through it. He did not tell her about the war yet, not the real parts. One evening in late December, a week before Christmas, he was sitting on the porch after supper. She had started asking him to eat at the table with her in the evenings, a shift that had happened so naturally that he had not noticed it until it was already established watching the stars come out in the vast Texas sky. She came out and sat in the other chair, wrapped in a wool shawl, and they sat together in the comfortable silence that was by now theirs. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The driving?" "Sometimes," he said honestly. "There's a freedom to it that's hard to find anywhere else. No walls, no obligations beyond the cattle and the outfit. But you stopped." "I did. Why?" He thought about it for a moment. The cold was settling in around them, the kind of still, clean cold that a clear winter night carried in open country. "I think I was looking for something that kept not being on the trail," he said, "and I thought maybe if I stopped moving I might find it." She was quiet for a moment. "Have you found it?" He looked at her. In the starlight, in the cold, with the shawl around her shoulders and her breath making small clouds in the air, she looked like something he had been trying to remember. "I'm starting to think I might be getting close," he said carefully, honestly. She looked at him for a long moment and then looked back at the stars, and there was something in her expression that he could not entirely read, but that made his chest tighten with a feeling he had not felt in a long time, something adjacent to hope, which had been a dangerous feeling once and might be again, but which he found he could not quite bring himself to put away. Christmas came and went quietly. Eva put a sprig of cedar on the kitchen table and cooked a proper meal, and they ate together without ceremony, but with a warmth that said ceremony was beside the point. She gave him a pair of good wool gloves, practical, the right size, which meant she had noticed the size of his hands. He had ridden into Calla Creek 2 days before and spent longer in Hob Greer's general store than was strictly necessary, looking for something that suited her. He had finally chosen a small book of botanical illustrations, Wildflowers of the Texas Plains, published in San Antonio, which Hob Greer had been given in trade and had never managed to sell. He wrapped it in brown paper and left it on the kitchen table on Christmas morning and watched from across the room as she opened it. She was quiet for a moment, turning the pages slowly, looking at the careful engravings of the flowers he had seen her looking at when they walked the pasture line, the firewheels and the bluebonnets and the evening primrose that she had pointed out to him more than once, naming them with an ease that said she loved them and had learned their names because love makes you want to know names. "How did you know?" she asked. "You talk about them," he said. "When we're walking the fence line, you always name them." She closed the book carefully and held it against her chest for a moment, and he saw something in her face that he did not want to misread, but that looked to him like a woman who was being seen and was startled by it. "Thank you, Dexter," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was something he filed away in that deep place where he kept the things that mattered. January brought cold, hard rain, and then the brief, improbable snow that occasionally descended on that part of Texas. A few inches that transformed the land for a day and a half into something almost unrecognizable, soft and white and muffled, before the sun came back and the melt began. During the snow, they were largely confined to the house, and the confinement changed things again. They played cards, she was better at it than him, and took modest but clear pleasure in that fact. They talked more freely than they had before, the way that being snowbound has always loosened people, stripped away the formalities that outdoor work and open space allowed them to maintain. She told him about Tennessee, about her childhood on a farm not entirely unlike this one, about her father who had been a man of strong convictions and occasional harshness, and her mother who had been a woman of quiet, subterranean strength. She asked him about his family, and he told her the truth: the early death of his mother, his father's drinking, the particular loneliness of a child who is not exactly unloved but is definitely unmoored. The army was almost a relief, he said, and then caught himself because that sounded wrong in a way that was hard to explain without the rest of it. Because it was structure, she said, not a question quite. The question of someone who has understood before you finished. Because it was company, he said, and purpose, and it gave you a very clear sense of what you were supposed to be doing at any given moment, which I had never had before. But then, she said carefully, but then I saw what it cost, he said. The structure and the company and the purpose, I saw what it cost. She did not push further, and he was grateful for it, and the gratitude was part of what was growing between them. A thing built out of the space she left for him as much as the space she filled. On the second evening of the snow, they had exhausted the cards, and the conversation had gone quiet in that comfortable way, and she had taken out some mending, while he was sharpening the tools that winter work allowed him time to attend to. And the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the only sounds were the small domestic sounds of two people occupying the same space easily. He looked up from the sharpening stone and found her watching him. She did not look away immediately, which was unusual and which meant something. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can always ask me something," he said. "What are you looking for? Out here, I mean." "You said you thought you might find it if you stopped moving." She held his gaze. "What is it?" He put down the sharpening stone. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, which she probably recognized because she waited without impatience. "When I was in the war," he said slowly, "I survived it by thinking about a place I was going, not a real place. I know that sounds odd." He stopped. "It doesn't sound odd," she said. "I gave it details," he said. "I gave it." He paused again because saying the next part was harder. "I gave it a woman, a face at a window, a voice, a laugh. I gave it the smell of a kitchen in the morning and the weight of a life that had something in it worth fighting toward." He was looking at his hands. "I know it was imaginary. I knew it was imaginary even then. But it kept me alive, and I came out the other side of the war looking for it because the only alternative was looking for nothing, and a man can't live on nothing." The room was very quiet. "And have you found any of it?" she said, and her voice was very careful, very deliberate. He looked up at her. "Yes," he said, "more of it than I expected." She held his gaze for a long time, and he could see her working through something, feeling the weight of it, deciding whether to set it down or carry it further. She had been a wife. She had buried that. She was a woman of 30 who had learned, hard and early, that love and loss came packaged together, and that the packaging got better with time but never entirely different. "I am not ready to be anyone's imagined home," she said, and there was honesty in it that he recognized and respected. "I am a real person, Dexter, with a real history and real difficulties and real days that are not very poetic." "I know," he said. "That's what I meant when I said more than I expected." "Because you're real, and real is better." She was quiet for a moment more. Then something shifted in her expression, a softening that had nothing soft about its core, the way water softens stone over time while the water remains entirely itself. "I think I'd like you to stay on through spring," she said, "if you're of a mind to." "I'm of a mind to," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a kiss, or an embrace, or any of the things that stories usually place at the turning point of two people toward each other. It was simply an acknowledgement, on both sides, that something had been recognized and was not going to be walked away from, and in the honest economy of how things actually happen between real people in real country, it was exactly enough. February came in cold and dry, and the work on the Hurst property had a rhythm by now that Dexter moved through with the ease of someone who had learned a place well. The longhorns in the north pasture had come through the cold well. The fence repairs he had made in November and December were holding. The barn was warmer and tighter than it had been before he arrived. There were small satisfactions in all of this that accumulated the way good days accumulate, quietly, solidly, into something you only fully see when you look back. He and Eva had settled into a new dailiness together. The evenings on the porch, weather permitting. The meals that were genuinely shared rather than politely endured. The conversations that ranged widely about the land, about the town of Calla Creek and its modest politics and feuds, about books she had and he read with a hunger she found touching, about the small news that arrived via the weekly mail rider who came through on Thursdays. He had written to Elias Cord in Abilene, partly to provide the reference he had offered Eva that first morning, and partly because Cord was one of the few men alive whose respect Dexter valued. Cord wrote back in March, a short letter in the blunt and functional prose of a man who used words carefully because he had never had many to spare, saying that Sawyer was the most reliable hand he had put on a drive in 5 years, and that whoever had hired him was lucky, and also that Cord hoped Dexter had found what he was looking for because a man who looked the way Sawyer looked on a drive, like he was always somewhere else at the same time, needed to find something solid to anchor him. Dexter read that letter twice and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and did not tell Eva what it said, but he thought about it for several days. In March, trouble came to the edge of their quiet in the form of a man named Cole Ritter. Cole Ritter was the owner of the Circle R Ranch, which was the largest spread within 20 miles of Calla Creek. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, possessed of a loud and certain manner that some men took for confidence, and that Dexter, in one meeting, identified as the particular confidence of someone who had never had a reason to question his own importance. Ritter had been interested in the Hurst property for some time, specifically, in buying it. The East Fork Creek access that Eva's 40 acres controlled was valuable to a man running a large herd, and Ritter was a man who understood the value of water rights in dry country. He arrived at the Hurst property one morning in the second week of March, riding a good bay horse and accompanied by a ranch hand who waited at the gate with the air of furniture. Ritter was polite in the surface way of men, who are accustomed to getting what they want through politeness, and intend to move to other methods if politeness fails. Eva received him on the porch with the same directness she brought to everything. Dexter was working in the barn and could hear the conversation through the open barn door. "Mrs. Hurst," Ritter said, "I'm going to be straight with you. I'll offer you $800 for this property. That is a fair price above market for the acreage, and you know it." "I know it," Eva said pleasantly. "I also know why you want the creek access, Mr. Ritter, and I know what it's worth to you once you have it. You're offering me fair value for the land. You're not offering me fair value for what the land does for you." Ritter was quiet for a moment. "A woman alone out here has a hard time of it," he said, and the observation was delivered as concern but arrived as pressure. "I'm not alone," Eva said, which was when Dexter walked out of the barn. He did not hurry. He carried his tools with him because he had been in the middle of a task, and he walked to the corral fence and leaned on it in the particular unhurried way of a man who is entirely comfortable and has nowhere he needs to be. He looked at Ritter. "Morning," he said. Ritter looked at him with the assessment of a man recalculating. "You hired on here." "Going on 4 months," Dexter said. The silence had a meaning that Ritter was clearly working through. Not that Dexter had done anything threatening, but that the picture of Eva Hurst alone on 40 acres had just been complicated by the presence of a man who looked, even leaning on a fence post in a work shirt, like someone who had spent years learning how to be difficult to remove. "Think about my offer, Mrs. Hurst," Ritter said, and he was still polite, but something had shifted in the quality of the politeness. "I've thought about it," Eva said. "No thank you, Mr. Ritter." He rode away, and Eva watched him go with an expression that Dexter had come to recognize, calm on the surface, thinking hard underneath. "He'll be back," Dexter said. "He's been back 3 times since Thomas died," she said. "He keeps raising the offer. He thinks eventually I'll have no choice." "Will you?" She turned and looked at him with the straightforward honesty that was one of the things he admired most in her. "If this spring's drive goes badly and I can't get ahead of the maintenance costs, possibly." She paused. "But I am not there yet." "Then let's make sure the spring drive goes well," he said. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was complicated in the best possible way. The expression of a woman who was grateful, and who was resisting being only grateful, and who was starting to understand that the man in front of her was not merely useful but was something else, something she was not yet ready to name in the daylight. "Get back to work," she said, and the tiny smile at the corner of her mouth said everything that the words did not. April came on warm and fast, the way spring arrives in South Texas. Not gradually, but all at once, the land going from winter brown to vivid green in what seemed like a single week, wildflowers appearing along the creek bank, and in the pasture margins in the exact colors she had pointed out to him in December, and that he now found in the pages of the botanical book he had given her. The bluebonnets were first, then the Indian paintbrush, then the delicate white of the evening primrose along the creek. He watched her walk the fence line one morning in mid-April with the book under her arm, stopping to compare the illustrations to the living flowers with a focused delight that was entirely her own and entirely beautiful. And he was struck again by that impossible feeling, the feeling of recognition, of arriving somewhere he had been trying to find, and the specific wonder of finding that the place was not what he had imagined but was better. He had told her, in the snow in January, about the imagined woman. She had not forgotten it. He could tell she had not forgotten it from the way she sometimes looked at him with a careful measuring quality, as though she was trying to determine how much of what he saw when he looked at her was her, and how much was that invented thing. It was a fair concern. He turned it over himself in honest moments. And the honest answer, as April warmed around them and the work of the property moved into its most demanding season, was this: the woman he had invented was a comfort, a survival mechanism, a shape cut out of necessity. Eva Hurst was a person. The two things did not overlap in the way that should have been a problem. Eva was not the fulfillment of an invention. She was an entirely separate and surprising discovery, and whatever feeling was growing in him toward her was rooted not in what he had imagined, but in what she actually was, the directness of her, the competence, the way she held her grief with both hands without drowning in it, the laugh, the hands, the patience that was not resignation. He told her this, or the essential part of it, on a warm April evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, and the sky was doing what Texas skies do in April, turning colors that had no business existing over a country so dry, orange and rose, and a deep blue at the top that seemed too dark for early evening. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it the right way." She turned and looked at him with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. "What I told you in January about the woman I imagined during the war, I need you to understand that I don't see her when I look at you. I see you. Those are completely different things, and it matters to me that you know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. The sky changed above them, deepening. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "Because you deserve to be seen as yourself," he said. "Not as the answer to someone's need, not as the end of someone's story, yourself." She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still in her lap, and the evening light was on her face, and she looked like the most real thing he had ever been close to. "Dexter," she said, and her voice had shifted quieter, more direct in a different way, the directness of someone opening a door rather than assessing whether to. "I have been alone for 18 months. I have been capable and careful, and I have kept this land, and I have kept myself, and I am proud of that. But I am tired of having no one to say something to in the evening that is not the inside of my own head." He said nothing, because she was not done. "I have been watching you since December," she said. "Not the way I watch the hired help, which is what you came as and which is not what you are anymore. We both know that. I have been watching you the way you watch something that you are afraid of wanting, because wanting means the possibility of losing." She paused. "Thomas was a good man and I loved him, and I will not speak badly of what we had. But I am 30 years old and it is April and the bluebonnets are out along the creek, and I am sitting next to a man who bought me a book of wildflowers because he paid attention, and I do not want to be careful about this anymore." Dexter turned toward her, and the last light of the evening caught her face, and he said very simply, "Then don't be." He reached across and took her hand, her capable, unhurried hand, exactly as he had not quite imagined it, and she let him hold it, and they sat like that in the turning dark, and it was not dramatic or extraordinary in its exterior details, but it was one of the most significant moments of Dexter Sawyer's life, and he knew it and was glad to know it. The spring cattle drive took place in late April and ran into May. Calla Creek was part of a small network of ranches that combined their herds for the drive north to the railhead at Abilene, a practice that allowed smaller operations like Eva's to participate in what would otherwise have been logistically impossible for a 40-acre spread with 12 longhorns. Dexter rode on the drive as her representative, working alongside the other hands from the neighboring ranches, and the drive was the kind of hard, dusty, days-long work that the trail always was: long hours in the saddle, river crossings, the constant management of several hundred head of cattle that had their own opinions about direction. He was good at it. The men he rode with recognized the particular quality of competence quickly on a drive. There was no politics to trail work, no seniority beyond what you could do when the herd spooked, or the weather turned, or the river ran higher than expected. Dexter worked quietly and effectively and was trusted with the difficult positions within a week, and by the time they reached Abilene, he had made 2 friendships of the genuine kind and one of the cordial kind, and had earned a reputation among the outfit that would follow him for years. The cattle sold well. The price at Abilene that spring was strong. The demand from the eastern markets was still building in the years following the war, and Texas longhorns were making fortunes for the men who could get them to the railhead. Eva's 12 head brought a price that was better than she had calculated in her most optimistic planning, and when Dexter rode back into Calla Creek in the second week of May with a bank draft in his pocket and corporal travel worn but sound, he found her waiting at the gate of the property in a way that told him she had been watching the road. He handed her the bank draft and she looked at the number for a long moment and then looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before: pure, uncomplicated relief, the face of a woman who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been permitted to put it down. "This is enough," she said, "for the maintenance and the back costs and a reserve besides." "It is," he said. "Ritter cannot touch this place," she said. "He cannot," he said. She reached up and took his face in both hands and kissed him, which was the first time, and he was so startled by the directness of it. So entirely Eva, no preamble, no negotiation, just the decision made and enacted, that for a moment he simply stood still. Then he wasn't still at all. The summer of 1868 settled over the Hurst property with the particular weight of a Texas summer, which was substantial and golden and very, very warm, and Dexter and Eva moved through it in the new mode that had been established by that kiss at the gate, openly, warmly, with the ease of 2 people who have decided that the thing between them is real and are no longer making the effort to pretend otherwise. It changed the shape of things in ways both small and large. The evenings on the porch were no longer the slightly careful exercises in closeness that they had been through the winter. They were simply where they sat together, without the distance that had been maintained by propriety and caution. The meals at the kitchen table had a different quality of ease. When they worked side by side on the property, and she worked alongside him often, not because she had to, but because she seemed to like it, the shared labor of a place that belonged to both of them in the ways that mattered. There was a new fluency to it, the particular ease of two people who have acknowledged that they are choosing each other. He found himself happy in a way he did not have much prior experience with. It was not the sharp, disorienting happiness of relief or victory. It was a quieter kind, the happiness of waking up and knowing where you are and being glad of it. He had not known, until Calla Creek, until Eva, that this was the kind of happiness that lasted. The other kind burned fast and left a different feeling. This kind was more like the creek itself, not dramatic, not loud, but continuous and dependable and deeper than it looked. In July, Cole Ritter made his fourth attempt on the property. This time he did not come alone, and he did not come in the morning with polite words. He rode in one afternoon with two men from his ranch, not his regular hands, but harder-looking men that Dexter did not recognize from the drive, and he stopped at the fence and called for Eva in a tone that had shed the politeness it had worn before. Dexter was at the barn when they arrived. He walked out and stood in the yard and said nothing, watching. "I'll offer $1,000, Ritter said to Eva, who was on the porch. "That is my last offer. After this, the situation becomes less comfortable for you." Dexter walked to the gate. He stood at the gate and looked at Ritter and at the two men with him, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that some silence is louder than words. "I think you should ride back to the Circle R," he said. "Mrs. Hurst has given you her answer 4 times. A 5th time is not going to change it, and coming here with these men to change the comfort of the situation is not something that's going to end well for you." Ritter looked at him with the particular fury of a man who is used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. "You're a hired hand," he said. "I'm not, actually," Dexter said. "But it doesn't matter what I am. What matters is that you're going to ride away from here right now, and you're going to stop coming. And if you're thinking about calculating the odds, what I want you to factor in is that I spent 3 years in the Army of the Tennessee being shot at by people considerably more frightening than you, and I'm not calculating odds. I'm just stating facts." The silence that followed had a quality to it that even Ritter's 2 hired men seemed to feel, because they shifted in their saddles with the slight discomfort of men who have just understood that the situation has changed shape. Ritter looked at Dexter for a long time. Then he looked at Eva, who had come to stand beside Dexter at the gate with an expression of absolute, unafraid calm. He turned his horse without another word and rode away, and his men went with him. Eva stood at the gate watching them go, and then she turned and looked at Dexter with an expression he could not entirely read. "That was a risk," she said. "It was a calculated one," he said. "He might come back with more men." "He might," Dexter agreed. "But men like Ritter mostly operate on the principle that the threat does the work for them. When you make clear that the threat isn't doing the work, they usually find easier targets." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm afraid of quite a lot," he said honestly. "But not of him." "What are you afraid of?" she asked. He looked at her. "Losing this," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, and her expression changed into something that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, something that combined happiness and the knowledge of how fragile happiness could be and the decision to have it anyway. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make supper." Ritter did not come back. There were stories, months later, about trouble the Circle R had with a competing ranch over water rights that took up all of Ritter's energy and legal resources for the better part of a year. And the general consensus in Calla Creek was that he had moved his attention to larger and more complicated problems. The Hurst property sat quietly on its 40 acres with its East Fork Creek access, and it was left alone. August brought heat and the long labor of the summer, and September came in cooler, and the bluebonnets were long gone, but there were other flowers in their place along the creek bank. The late-season blooms that Eva named for him now, adding to his vocabulary of the land. He had taken to walking the creek line with her on Sunday mornings, not because there was work to be done, but because she liked to do it and because walking beside her along the creek in the cool of early morning, with the cottonwood leaves just beginning to consider going yellow and the water clear and the light soft, was something he would have been glad to do for the rest of his life. He told her that. They were standing at the bend in the creek where the water made a small natural pool before continuing south, and the morning light was on the water and on her face, and he said it without planning to, "I would be glad to do this for the rest of my life," and she turned and looked at him with the patient gray-green eyes and said nothing for a moment. "Is that a statement or a question?" she asked. "It's whatever you'd like it to be," he said. "I would like it," she said carefully, "to be a question." He turned to face her fully. He was 30 years old now, had turned 30 in August, a fact she had marked with a cake that was imperfect and wonderful. He had come a very long way from the skinny, hollow-eyed soldier who had walked out of the war with a borrowed face in his memory and a vague direction west. He had come a very long way even from the man who had ridden into Calla Creek a year ago on a horse with a thrown shoe, looking for work and looking, though he wouldn't have named it, for the thing he had been building in his imagination through 4 years of war. "Eva," he said, "I am asking." She held his gaze and he could see her weighing it, not with reluctance but with the seriousness it deserved, the way she had always been serious about the things that mattered. She had been a wife once and she had loved that and she had buried that and she had rebuilt herself around the loss, and she was not a woman who undertook things casually. "I want to be clear about what you're asking," she said. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "I'm asking to stay here, on this land with you. I'm asking to be the person who walks this creek with you on Sunday mornings for the rest of however long we get. And I'm asking because I want to, not because it's convenient, and not because you look like something I once needed you to look like. I'm asking because you're Eva Hurst, and you're the most real thing that's ever been in my life." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in the direct and simple way that was entirely hers, "Yes." He kissed her beside the creek with the cottonwood leaves going yellow around them and the water running clear over the stones, and when they pulled apart she was smiling with the full version of the laugh, not surprised this time, not building slowly, just present and warm and real. They were married in November of 1868, a year and a day, almost exactly, from the morning he had ridden in through the gate, and she had studied him from the porch and made her assessment. The preacher came through on his circuit and married them in the small church on a cold, clear Saturday morning, with Hob Greer and his wife in attendance and Lou Dawes from the saloon, and 3 of the neighboring ranch families who had come to know both of them over the course of the year. It was not a large ceremony. Neither of them had wanted large. They wanted true, and true is not a function of numbers. Eva wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself, and her hair was up, and she stood beside him in front of the preacher, with the expression she brought to everything that mattered direct and clear and entirely herself, without performance or pretense. Dexter wore his best shirt, which was not the most impressive shirt in the territory, but he had his hair cut and his jaw clean-shaved, and he stood next to her with the feeling of a man who has arrived, after a very long journey and many wrong turns and one borrowed map made entirely of hope, at the exact place he was supposed to be. When the preacher asked if he took this woman, he said, "I do," with more certainty than he had brought to anything in his life. When the preacher asked if she took this man, she said, "I do," and looked at Dexter directly as she said it, and it was one of the things he would carry with him always. The way she had looked at him when she said it, without reservation, without looking away. The winter of 1868 going into 1869 was their first winter as husband and wife, and it had a different quality from the winter before, warmer in the particular way that a house becomes warmer when it is no longer a place you are uncertain of your right to occupy. The barn was his barn in all the ways that mattered, and the house was his house, and the woman who moved through it in the mornings with her coffee and her deliberate daily purpose was his wife. And these were facts that he tested gently and regularly, the way you test the weight of something valuable to be sure it is still there. And it was always there. They had their disagreements, as two people of independent minds living at close quarters always do. She was the kind of person who thought decisions through from the beginning, and he was the kind who often began in the middle and worked outward. And this produced a certain creative friction when they were making plans about the property, about how many head to add to the herd, about whether to fence the north pasture entirely or leave the northern section open for the winter graze, about the practicalities of expanding the kitchen garden. Their arguments were never cruel and never long, because they were both, at their cores, people who cared more about arriving at the right answer than about being right, and that made all the difference. She told him more about Thomas through that winter, not all at once, but in the gradual way that trust allows, bits and pieces over supper, a story here, a memory there. He listened without jealousy, which surprised him, and then didn't, because he understood that her love for Thomas was not something she was keeping from him. It was part of the whole person he had married, and the whole person was what he wanted. "He would have liked you," she said one evening, quite simply. "I hope so," Dexter said. "He would have. He liked people who were honest about their troubles." "I've got troubles enough to be liked by anyone on those terms," he said, and she laughed the full laugh, and the kitchen was warm. Spring came again, and with it the second cattle drive, this time by arrangement with two of the neighboring ranches, a combined operation with a larger herd that brought better prices at the railhead and established a pattern that would serve all three operations for years. The drive went well. Dexter was trusted this time with responsibilities that went beyond his own employer's cattle, and he handled them with the same undemonstrative competence that had defined his first season on the trail. He came back from that drive to Eva standing at the gate again, as she had the first time, but this time when he rode up and swung down from Corporal, she was smiling in a way that was different from the ordinary smile, bigger, and slightly nervous in a way she was never nervous about ordinary things. She handed him the bank draft first, because she was practical, and then she said, "I have something else to tell you." He looked at her face and read the nervousness and the brightness and the particular quality of a person who is holding news that is large and good and slightly terrifying all at once, and he said, before she could say it, "Are you expecting?" She blinked. "How did you?" "You don't get nervous about things," he said. "You get nervous about things that matter a great deal." She laughed and put her hands over her face for a moment and then put them down and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I am. October, I think." He stood in the warm May afternoon and felt it settle through him, the information and its weight and its rightness. He crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a long moment, breathing the same warm air. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Enormously," he said. "Are you?" "Enormously," she agreed. "Good," he said. "I think that's the correct response." She laughed again, and they went inside together, and the summer opened before them with a quality of light that seemed, to both of them, unusual and generous. The months of her pregnancy were months in which Dexter recalibrated everything about how he worked, without being asked to, and without announcing that he was doing it. He took on more of the physical labor without comment. He managed the cattle more carefully, watched the fence lines with more attention, did the heavy repairs that needed doing and deferred the ones that could wait. He drove into Calla Creek more often than before, partly for supplies and partly, he admitted to himself, to be in proximity to other people who might be useful, though Eva was healthy and strong and showed no signs of needing anyone to manage things for her, which she would have said clearly and directly if asked. In August, with the heat at its highest and the baby 3 months away, Dexter built a rocking chair for the porch. He was a fair carpenter, as he had told her that first morning, and the rocking chair was better than fair. He had taken his time with it, using good wood and good joinery, and it was a handsome piece of work when he was finished. He brought it out one evening without ceremony and set it on the porch, and Eva came out and saw it and ran her hand along the back of it. "You built this," she said. "I had some spare time in the evenings," he said. She sat down in it and rocked once, testing. It was balanced perfectly. She looked up at him with the full force of her attention. "Thank you," she said, in the same voice she had used when she opened the book of wildflowers that Christmas morning, the voice of a woman who has been seen and is moved by it. "You're welcome," he said. September and October passed in the golden, slightly tense way of waiting for something that is coming and cannot be hurried. Eva was well through both months, carrying the pregnancy with the same practical dignity she brought to everything difficult. The baby moved frequently. She would press Dexter's hand to her side in the evenings, and he would feel the movement under his palm with an emotion too large and too new to have a name. On the 3rd of November, 1869, just over 2 years after the morning Dexter Sawyer had ridden in through the gate on a horse with a thrown shoe, their son was born. It was a hard labor, lasting most of a day and into the night, attended by Mrs. Cord, the wife of the town's general practitioner, who was a capable and calm-handed woman who had attended many births and who managed the process with the efficiency of experience. Dexter sat on the porch through much of it, doing the thing that men in those circumstances did, the helpless waiting, the listening for sound through walls, the turning of his hat in his hands and the watching of the sky, which that night was clear and cold and full of stars that seemed, in his state of mind, almost unreasonably beautiful. He heard the baby cry just before midnight, a strong, immediate, entirely unambiguous announcement, and he stood up from the porch steps so fast that he knocked his hat off, and Mrs. Cord opened the door a few minutes later with an expression that said everything was well before she said it in words. He was allowed in, and Eva was exhausted and pale and entirely herself, and she was holding their son, who was red and wrinkled and furious about existence in a way that Dexter found extremely reassuring. "He is angry," Dexter said, standing at the bedside looking down at them both. "He has a right to be," Eva said, her voice worn thin with tiredness but full of something deep and warm. "It's a difficult arrival. What do we call him?" Dexter asked. She had thought about it, he knew. They had discussed names over the summer, and she had expressed preferences, and he had expressed preferences, and they had arrived nowhere conclusive. But she had the look now of someone who has just made a decision. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Dexter Sawyer." He looked at her and she held his gaze, and there was nothing complicated about what she was offering. It was simple and loving and generous, a way of bringing together the things she had loved without division or competition. "Thomas Dexter Sawyer," he repeated. "If you're agreed," she said. "I am," he said. "Entirely." He sat on the edge of the bed and she leaned against him carefully, and he held them both, his wife and his son, in the particular silence of an enormous and happy thing, and looked at the window where the night sky showed through, stars unreasonably bright, and felt the kind of gratitude that has no adequate expression and does not need one. Thomas Sawyer was a loud and opinionated infant who grew into a loud and opinionated toddler with his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's dark hair, and an absolute conviction about what he wanted from any given situation that charmed the entire population of Calla Creek, who began stopping at the Hurst, now Sawyer property, with what Dexter recognized as the particular interest that a small town takes in its children. By the spring of 1871, Dexter had formally registered the property in both their names. It was a practical measure and also a symbolic one. The land that had been Eva's had become theirs, the way the house had become theirs, and the work had become theirs, and the Sunday morning walks along the creek had become theirs. He had, some time ago, transferred the title of corporal to the property's general stable, not with any sense of loss but with the sense of arrival. The trail horse had become a ranch horse, which was a kind of settling that Dexter understood very well. In the summer of 1871, Hob Greer mentioned to Dexter one morning in the general store that the property adjacent to the east, another 40 acres that had been abandoned by its homesteader, who had gone back east after 2 failed harvests, was available for claim under the Homestead Act. Dexter listened with the careful attention he brought to anything involving land and water, and rode the boundary of the adjacent property that afternoon, and came back and laid out what he had found on the kitchen table with the particular systematic clarity of a man who had once navigated by military maps. "The creek continues through it," he said. "If we fence the south section for winter grass and let the north section grow as meadow, we could run a herd double what we have currently without overgrazing either section." Eva looked at the rough map he had drawn. Her finger traced the creek line. "The claim would need a structure on it within the year," she said, because she knew the Homestead Act's requirements as well as he did. "I can build a structure within the month," he said. She looked up from the map and she was smiling that wide, entirely present smile that he had been watching for 3 years now, and that never failed to do something to his chest. "Then file the claim," she said. He filed the claim in Calla Creek's land office on a Tuesday in August, and by September he had built a small but solid structure on the new parcel. Not a house, exactly, but more than the law required, with a foundation and 2 rooms and a proper roof, because he did not do things by halves. By the following spring, the herd had grown to 30 head, and the south section of the new parcel was fenced, and the meadow to the north was providing exactly the winter grass he had assessed it would. The town of Calla Creek was growing, in those years, not dramatically, but with the persistent accumulation of people who recognized good land and dependable water when they found it. A school had been established in a building at the east end of the main street, and Eva became one of its primary supporters and occasional teachers. She had an education that was uncommon in women of her time and place, and she was not modest about using it, because false modesty was a thing she had never had patience for. She taught reading to the younger children on Thursday afternoons, using a rotation of the books she owned, and several she convinced Hob Greer to stock, and she did it with the same direct competence she brought to everything else. Dexter watched her with those children on the occasions he rode into town on Thursdays and would sometimes, rather than go to the general store immediately, lean against the wall outside the school window and listen to the sound of her voice teaching, which was one of the things he added to his private inventory of what she was, a list that had grown, over 3 years of marriage, to be long and various and entirely irreducible to the imagined woman he had once carried to war. In the autumn of 1871, he told her the full story of the war, not the polished version that he told himself on easy days, the version that emphasized the camaraderie and the resolution. The real version, the Shiloh crossing and what he had seen there, the faces of men he had known and lost, the particular smell of a battlefield in summer that he would wake sweating from in some years without even the dignity of a dream to explain why. The 3 months in a hospital tent that had taken him out of the fighting in the 2nd year, and that he did not talk about because they contained things he had not talked about to anyone, ever. Eva listened. She did not flinch, and she did not offer premature comfort, and she did not tell him it was over, because she was not the kind of person who offered people the easy consolation of pretending that past things were entirely past. She listened until he was finished, and then she sat beside him in the dark of the bedroom, Thomas asleep in his room down the hall, the house quiet around them, and she put her hand on his chest over his heart and held it there. "I know it's still with you," she said. "Parts of it are," he said. "Parts of it will be," she said. "And you can have parts of it be and still be here. That's what here means, both of them at the same time." He covered her hand with his own and held it there, her hand over his heart, and he thought about the years in the army when he had tried to build this, the warmth, the presence, the specific weight of not being alone. He thought about how poor an invention it had been against the reality. He thought about how the reality was so far beyond the invention that comparing them was almost comical. "Eva," he said. "I know," she said, as though he had said something longer and more articulate. "Do you?" he asked. "You were going to say something about being grateful," she said. "About this, about us." "Something like that," he admitted. "I know," she said again, and she moved closer, and the night went on around them, and the land was quiet outside. And 30 longhorns were in the north pasture, and Thomas was asleep down the hall and the Sawyer property, both parcels of it. The original 40 and the new 40 was solid under them and entirely theirs. The years went on in the way of good years, which is to say they were not uncomplicated or without difficulty, but they had a foundation deep enough to hold. There was a drought in 1872 that tested every ranch in the county and required them to make hard decisions about the herd that neither of them took lightly. There was a year when Thomas had a fever that lasted 2 weeks and kept Eva and Dexter by his bedside in shifts, both of them carrying the particular terror of parents watching a child through illness, until the fever broke and he sat up and demanded his breakfast with such conviction that they both laughed with the relief of it. There were neighbors to help and neighbors who needed helping, the perpetual social weave of a small frontier town where people depended on each other, because the alternative was depending on nothing, and nothing in the face of a hard winter or a cattle sickness or a fire was a serious business. Dexter became known in those years as a man who showed up when things needed doing, not loudly, not with drama, but with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who understood that the work was the point and the recognition was beside it. He helped 3 neighboring operations through hard seasons with loans of his own time and equipment, and the reciprocity of it built him into the fabric of Calla Creek in a way that he had not expected, and that gave him a satisfaction he had not anticipated. Eva was already part of that fabric, had been since before he arrived, through the quiet constancy of her presence on the land and her involvement in the school and her willingness to speak her mind at the town meetings that were held monthly in the church when the preacher was not using it. She was not a woman who was easily overlooked, and in a town that had settled into enough stability to begin caring about its institutions and its values, her voice mattered. There was a town meeting in 1873 at which the subject of the school's Indian students came up. There were 2 families, Comanche, who had come in from the reservation and settled on the town's margins, their children attending school with the other children. A group of men wanted to establish a separate arrangement. Eva stood up in the meeting and spoke about it with such directness and such irrefutable logic, pointing out that the children were learning the same lessons and deserving of the same education, and that any other arrangement said more about the men proposing it than about the children affected, that the proposal was voted down by a margin that satisfied her, if not entirely. Dexter had been in the back of the church during that meeting, watching her stand at the front with her chin up and her voice perfectly steady, and had felt the full force of that feeling again: recognition, arrival, the specific wonder of being loved by someone this particular. She sat down next to him afterward, slightly flushed with the effort of it. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "You could have said something." "You were doing fine," he said. She gave him the sideways look that meant she was choosing not to argue about something. "Next time you could still say something." "Next time I will," he said. "Thank you," she said, and the flush was still in her cheeks, and she looked exactly like the person he had been walking beside for 5 years by then, and he loved every specific and unreproducible thing about her. In the spring of 1874, Eva told him she was expecting again. This time he did not read the news before she told him. She told him over breakfast, setting down her coffee cup with the deliberate precision of someone who has been holding a fact in their hands for a few days and is now ready to give it its space in the world. "I'm expecting," she said. He put down his fork and looked at her across the table. Thomas, who was 4½ and already capable of making his presence extremely felt, was in the other room making a sound like a cavalry charge with a wooden horse that Dexter had carved for him the previous Christmas. "When?" he said. "November again, I think," she said. "I seem to favor November." He got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands, and she looked down at him with the warm, slightly exasperated expression of a woman who is touched by something and finds the being touched a little funny. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not worried about you." "Then what are you doing on the floor?" "I wanted to be close to you when I told you that I am very happy," he said, "and the floor seemed like the right height for it." She laughed the full laugh, no preamble, no building, just there, and he stood up and kissed her, and Thomas appeared in the doorway with his wooden horse and announced, at considerable volume, that he was hungry. The second child was a girl, born on the 14th of November, 1874. The labor was easier this time. Eva knew what to expect and managed it with the characteristic competence that she brought to everything she had done before. The baby came into the world with less fury than Thomas had, but with an alertness that Mrs. Cord, who attended again, said she had not seen often in a newborn wide eyes that seemed, in the first minutes of life, to be making a thorough assessment of everything. Eva looked at the baby and then at Dexter and said, "She has your expression." "What expression?" he said. "The one that says you are taking in information and deciding what to do with it," she said. He looked at his daughter, which was a word he turned over several times and thought that Eva might be right. "What do we call her?" he asked. Eva had thought about this one for weeks, he knew. "Clara," she said. "Clara May Sawyer." "Clara May," he repeated and tested it and found it right. Yes. Clara May Sawyer was, from her earliest age, an intensely observant child who did everything on her own terms and at her own pace, and with a thoroughness that was entirely her mother. Thomas, who had been the center of the universe for 4 years and was now required to share that position, adapted with reasonable grace. There was a period of about 3 weeks during which he was difficult in ways that Dexter and Eva managed with patience and humor, and then he accepted his sister as an irreversible fact and became, in the way of children who have no choice in the matter, fiercely attached to her. The Sawyer property in 1875 was a different thing from the 40-acre spread that Eva had been managing alone in 1867. The combined 80 acres, original and homestead claim, ran a herd of 35 longhorns through 2 well-fenced pastures. The house had been expanded twice, with a second bedroom added in 1870 for Thomas and a larger kitchen built in 1872, because the original one had been too small for the life they were actually living in it. The barn had been rebuilt with proper timber framing that would hold for decades. There was a garden that produced enough vegetables through the growing season that Eva put up preserves through the summer that lasted well into the following spring. It was, in every material sense, a successful operation, not wealthy, not extravagant, but sound and growing and deeply, practically rooted in its land and its community. But the material success was not, Dexter knew, the most important thing about it. The most important thing about it was that it was alive in the way that things are alive when the people who made them love each other and love the thing they made together. He still walked the creek with Eva on Sunday mornings, whenever weather and the children's schedules allowed. Thomas sometimes came with them now, at 6 and 7 years old, a wide-ranging and energetic companion who asked questions about everything at high volume and who was clearly going to be a person who needed to know things. Clara, when she was old enough, was carried and then walked between them, her small hand in her father's large one, looking at the creek with those assessing eyes. Eva still named the flowers. She had long since memorized the botanical book he had given her that first Christmas, and she named them without looking it up, pointing and reciting with the easy fluency of someone who has integrated knowledge into love. She added to them. She had acquired 2 other books over the years, one on birds and one on the geology of the Texas Hill Country, and she had the same relationship with those as with the flowers. She learned the names because she loved the things. Dexter had learned to read the land in a different way than he had when he came, not the military geography of advantage and exposure that had been his first vocabulary of terrain, but the slower and more patient vocabulary of a working property. He knew where the creek ran shallow in dry years and where it held. He knew which pasture section dried out first in summer heat and needed rotating first. He knew the particular behavior of the herd in the 3 days before a north wind, which he could not explain and had stopped trying to, and he moved the cattle accordingly and was usually right. He had become, without intending to and without marking the transition, a man who knew where he lived, not just the geography of it, but the full sense of the word, the particular gravity of belonging to a place, of being known by it as much as knowing it. He turned 37 in August of 1875. Eva turned 38 in November, a week after Clara's first birthday, and he made her a cake that was better than the one she had made him. He had practiced quietly over the years, and they ate it after the children were in bed, the two of them at the kitchen table with the single candle lit, and she looked at him across the table with the gray-green eyes that he knew as well as he knew his own hands by now and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When you came here," she said, "I was managing. I want you to understand the difference between managing and living because I know the difference now that I didn't quite know it before." She paused. "Managing is what you do when the thing you had is gone and you have to find a reason to continue. Living is what happens when you have something again that makes the continuing worthwhile." She held his gaze. "You gave me that back." He said nothing for a moment because the words were too large for a quick answer. Then, "You gave it to me first," he said. "I was carrying a picture of something I'd invented and you replaced it with the real thing. You didn't know you were doing that, but you did." She smiled, not the full laugh, just the quiet smile, the one that was entirely interior and only showed at the edges. "We should probably thank each other more often," she said. "We should," he agreed. "Consider this a standing thank you," she said. "Ongoing, for whatever comes next." "Ongoing," he agreed. "For whatever comes next." Whatever came next was, in fact, more years, and they were years of the same essential quality, which was not to say they were easy or unchanged, but that they had the foundation that made difficulty manageable and change navigable. The cattle business went well in some years and required patience in others. Thomas grew into a boy of strong opinions and considerable intelligence, who gave them both equal proportions of pride and anxiety. Clara grew into a girl who was methodical and curious and deeply attached to the land in the same way her mother was. By the time she was 3, she was following Eva through the garden with a proprietary interest that made Dexter smile every time he watched it. There were neighbors who came and went. The perpetual mobile quality of the frontier that meant the population of Calla Creek shifted and grew and occasionally contracted as people proved the land out or gave it up. There were hard winters and good springs, and the ordinary drama of a small cattle town, disputes over fence lines, a fire at the livery in 1876 that the whole town came out to fight, and that was contained before it spread. The slow accumulation of news from the wider world that arrived with the mail rider and the occasional newspaper, and was discussed over meals and over the counter at Hob Greer's General Store. Dexter and Eva Sawyer were, by 1876, as much a part of Calla Creek as the creek itself. They were known in the way that people who have been somewhere long enough become known, with the particular depth of familiarity that includes both what you show the world and a fair portion of what you keep private. People came to Dexter for practical advice and came to Eva for something less definable but equally real, for the quality of her attention, her directness, the sense that talking to her would produce clarity. The war receded. Not entirely, it never entirely does, for the men who were in it, and Dexter did not pretend that it had gone, because pretense was not something he had ever been good at. But it receded the way things recede when you have enough present to weigh against the past, when the present is full enough and warm enough that the cold places get smaller by comparison. He still occasionally woke in the night from something that was not quite a dream, and Eva was always there, not performing wakefulness, but genuinely awake, as though some part of her stayed alert for the nights when he needed someone to be present. She would put her hand on his back and say nothing, and the nothing was everything that was needed. He thought about the man he had been in the war, the young soldier pressing himself into the dirt while the world came apart around him, building a face in his mind to go home to. He thought about what he would tell that man if the conversation were somehow possible across the span of years. He would say, "The invention was a reasonable tool, given the circumstances, and you should not be embarrassed by it." He would say, "The real thing is better than anything you imagined, not because it's easier but because it's true." He would say, "You will be surprised by how much of the wanting turns out to be answerable by specific and particular things. The sound of a specific woman's laugh, the particular way a specific piece of land looks in April light, the weight of 2 children sleeping in the house around you at night." He would say, "You did not know what home was, and you invented it, and then you found it, and those are 3 separate and all-important things." In the autumn of 1877, with Thomas 8 years old and Clara 3, they had a photograph made. A photographer had come to Calla Creek with his equipment as part of a survey commission, and he offered, for a modest fee, to take portraits of the town families. Eva was interested immediately. She had never had a photograph made and was forthright about finding the whole process fascinating. Dexter was less certain, but was not going to be the one to deny her the thing she found fascinating. They dressed in their good clothes on a Saturday morning and went into town and stood in front of the photographer's arrangement. And Thomas stood beside his father with a 6-year-old serious expression, and Clara stood beside her mother and looked at the camera with those assessing eyes, and the photographer told them to hold still and made the exposure. The photograph existed after that as a small but definite fact evidence, in the plain and material sense, of the life they had built. Eva framed it and hung it in the kitchen, which was where the family lived most fully, and Dexter would sometimes look at it when he came in from the morning chores, at the 4 of them standing together on a Saturday morning in Calla Creek, Texas, in 1877, and think about the improbability of it. The chain of events, the thrown horseshoe, the cold October evening, the porch, the still-water patience of Eva Hurst's gray-green eyes. And feel the particular gratitude of a man who knows how close he came to none of it. In December of 1878, on a cold, clear evening much like the one when they had first sat together on the porch 11 years before and watched the stars come out, Dexter came in from checking the cattle and found Eva at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand. She had an expression he recognized, the careful one, the thinking hard underneath the calm one. "What is it?" he asked, pulling off his coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. "A letter from my sister in Tennessee," she said. "She's asking if she can come out for a visit in the spring. She has 2 children and her husband died last year and I think she stopped. You think she's asking if there's land," he said. Eva looked at him. "The Kendrick property is available, the 40 acres on the West Fork." "I know it," he said. He sat down at the table across from her. "It's good land." "She knows how to work it," Eva said. "She was raised on a farm, same as I was." He considered it for a moment not the land which he had already assessed in the way he assessed all the land around them as a matter of habit, but the implications, the shape of what she was asking without quite asking. "Tell her to come in April," he said. "We'll have time to look at the Kendrick property with her before the summer work gets heavy." Eva looked at him across the table and her expression did the thing it had done on the porch all those years ago, the thing that still, after 11 years, did something to his chest, the opening of it, the warmth of being seen by someone who chose to see you. "You are a very good man, Dexter Sawyer," she said. "I'm a reasonable man," he said. "You're a good woman. The distinction matters." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers in the familiar way, the weight and warmth of it as known to him now as the land under his feet, as the sound of his children asleep down the hall, as the smell of the kitchen in the morning, as the creek in April, as everything that the word home had slowly come to contain and mean and be. Outside, the Texas sky was doing what it always did on clear winter nights, putting on the full production. All the stars and all the cold, and all the enormous, indifferent, beautiful dark that was neither kind nor unkind, but was simply the world as it was. And in the kitchen the stove was warm and the lamp was lit, and Thomas and Clara were asleep, and Eva's hand was in his, and Dexter Sawyer was home. Not the invention. Not the desperate imagining of a young soldier holding himself together in the mud. The real thing, imperfect and detailed and irreplaceable, built out of a thrown horseshoe and a cold October evening, and a woman on a porch who had studied him and then, over years and seasons and everything that those years and seasons contained, chosen him back. Eva's sister, Mabel, came in April as they had planned with her 2 boys, 7 and 5, and stayed in the house while Dexter and Eva showed her the Kendrick property and helped her assess what it would take to make it work. Mabel was a practical woman with the same family directness that Eva had, and she looked at the land the way the Hurst women apparently looked at everything, with her full attention and her honest assessment. She filed the claim in June, and by August she had a house with Dexter's help and the help of 2 neighboring ranch families who came out for the raising the way they had always come out for each other. The practical solidarity of people who understood that the margin between making it and not making it was often exactly the width of a neighbor showing up. The West Fork land was good, as Dexter had assessed. Mabel's boys grew up alongside Thomas and Clara in the way of cousins who lived close enough to be daily companions, which enriched all 4 of them in ways that were impossible to quantify and entirely visible in the people they became. By 1880, when the United States Census counted Calla Creek and found it a town of 212 people, real numbers, real names, a real place with a real future, the Sawyer name appeared in those pages twice. Dexter and Eva Sawyer on the East Fork, Mabel Hurst on the West Fork, and between those 2 entries in the quiet spaces that censuses do not capture, the full texture of the life they had built. Dexter was 42 that year. Eva was 43. Thomas was 10 and loud and absolutely certain of his opinions about cattle and land, and the relative qualities of various horses, which was exactly what both his parents had been at that age in their different ways. Clara was 6 and had surpassed her mother's botanical knowledge in terms of sheer enthusiasm, if not yet in depth, and had recently begun demanding to know the names of every bird she could see from the porch, a project that was keeping Eva fully engaged with the bird book and Clara fully engaged with the porch. The property had expanded once more, a small additional parcel to the south that Dexter had acquired in a straightforward land deal in 1879, which gave them the southern water access they had always worked around. The herd was 40 head now, a sustainable number for the land as they managed it, and the spring drives continued to produce the steady income that kept the operation sound and gave them the reserve that meant they did not lie awake at night calculating margins. On an October evening in 1880, the month of Dexter's arrival in Calla Creek, 13 years before, he and Eva sat on the porch in the 2 chairs that had been there since the beginning, the original one that had come with the house and the rocking chair he had built in 1869 that was still sound and still perfectly balanced, because he had built it to last. The children were inside. Mabel was at her own property a mile away. The cattle were in the north pasture, and the creek was running clear, and the sky was doing the October thing it always did, turning that particular shade of deepening blue above the western hills. "Do you remember the first winter?" Eva said. "I remember all of it," he said. "What do you remember most?" He thought about it. "The snow," he said. "The 2 days when it snowed and we were inside together. I think that was when I knew." "Knew what?" "That I was not going anywhere." She smiled, looking at the sky. "I knew before that," she said. "Did you?" "The wildflower book," she said. "Christmas, when you gave me the wildflower book." He was quiet for a moment, watching the sky change. "I just noticed that you named them," he said. "That's what I mean," she said. The night came in around them. The way Texas nights came in on clear October evenings, fully and without apology, the stars appearing one by one, and then all at once in the way that always felt like a demonstration of something, though what exactly was hard to say. They sat together in the dark and the warmth of the house came through the window behind them, and inside Thomas was doing something noisy and Clara was protesting it in her methodical way, and the sounds of the children were the sounds of the house, and the house was on the land, and the land was theirs, and this was what he had survived the war toward, what he had ridden west for, what he had found on a cold October morning when a horse threw a shoe 3 miles outside of Calla Creek, Texas. In the year of 1867, not the woman he had imagined, better. The woman who had been here on this land, working it and knowing it and waiting not for him specifically, because she had not been waiting for him specifically, but waiting the way all real things wait, simply by being continuous and whole and present for whatever was coming next. And what had come next was Dexter Sawyer, carrying his invented home like a lantern in a storm, and finding that the storm had deposited him on the exact threshold of something real, and that real, as he had told her once beside a winter stove, was better. He reached out in the dark and found her hand where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and she turned her palm up without looking away from the stars, and he held it, and the night went on in the enormous and specific way of a life that has arrived at its own best version of itself, with nothing unresolved and nothing yet over, and everything, the land and the children and the creek and the years ahead, and the woman beside him and the stars above them, and the warm house behind them. Everything finally and completely and irreversibly his.